without further ado, we'll go ahead and I'll hand off to Nick Long from NREL. Nick, microphone's all yours.
Great, thank you, Mike. Welcome everybody to our Building Data Exchange webinar. I think this is our first webinar from this subcommittee of IBPSA. Anyway, we have 3 talks today. First one will be Chip Barnaby discussing some guidelines related to Building Data Exchange. Ted Summer will be discussing Schematron and BuildingSync, and Stephen Roth will be discussing the use of Schema Server to help exchange some data. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So Chip Barnaby. Chip is a independent consultant. He does lots of software development. Most of his work is now devoted to CSE, which is the detailed model used at the California Energy Commission related to Title 24 compliance. So Chip, go ahead.
Okay, am I audible?
You are.
Yes.
Good. Okay, I'm going to talk about ASHRAE Guideline 20. And if you go to the next slide. So the goal here that we got going on a long time ago in ASHRAE was to improve the productivity and quality of software related to the built environment. And so we were trying to find ways to match user workflow and get decent work sequences and minimize workarounds in software and promote interoperability in general and avoid reformatting of data and all these good things that we've all been working on for 20+ years. So the idea was to get good application support for the procedures used in primarily, originally at least, in sort of ASHRAE engineering practice. So next slide. So, you know, the problem faced is that software developers are brilliant people and know a huge amount of stuff about many technical things, none of which has anything to do with buildings, modeling, or simulation. And so to make good applications for our domain, you need the knowledge from our domain, which are calculation methods, data requirements, workflows that are practical for doing the tasks involved in building modeling and other engineering applications. So the need was seen as one of getting a method for capturing domain-specific processes that could then lead to better software. So that produced, on the next slide, the ASHRAE Guideline entitled Documenting HVAC&R Work Processes and Data Exchange Requirements. This was published, go next slide, please. So this was published originally in 2010 after several years of work. And then it was reaffirmed without change in 2016. And now we are just getting started on a significant revision to see if we can bring it up to date and make it more useful. So the aim of the thing is at domain experts, not data modeling experts. So it's deliberately fairly informal, and it contrasts with other efforts, of which there are a fair number, but one of them is say the Building Smart Information Delivery Manual scheme, which is an ISO standard. And the reaction, at least of some of us involved on Guideline 20, is we basically can't understand that. It's too data model-y, and it's very difficult to for quote unquote human beings to present the information the way they want it. So the idea of Guideline 20 was a use case, and so on the next slide, the idea was to capture what should happen for a particular activity, and more in the form of a user story, a little more formal than a user story, but still quite informal. And so there's a general structure, And the parts that are specified that are to be written in one of these documents is the name, purpose, description, the identity of the actors, the activities, the data transactions, and the required data groups and data elements. So just going through this a bit as an example, next slide. The idea was that we directed people to make a meaningful name for the use case. So for instance, an example I'm going to kind of follow along here a bit would be calculating loads for during a design process. So the name would be calculate building thermal loads. And this would be stated in a verb form because the whole thing is description of an activity. And then the purpose section is a high-level statement of what this use case is. And the example we made up these identifiers in guideline 20 for a initial group of use cases. So the ANG01 use case describes determination of building heating and cooling load requirements during the design of a new or renovated facility. So the purpose is a short and sweet statement of what this thing is about. And then next slide. So then there's a narrative, which is a description, which is a narrative sort of that says who does what with what info, where does the information come from, where does it go to, what are the results, where do the results go? And so it includes background and context for the specifics involved in the process. And it would note non-obvious aspects. For instance, in load calculations, there's zoning issues and maybe iteration required in either a design process or in actual calculations. So anything that's not straightforward would be flagged. Next. Then the actors are identified, and there's a key actor who is kind of the focus of the activity. Then other actors involved in the activity would be called out, would be identified. And some are data suppliers, some are data consumers, some are both. And some actors are software or databases. So it's not just people involved in an activity, it's the information sources and sinks. And so for loads example, you'd have a key actor would be the mechanical engineer, and then the owner, the architect, lighting designer, electrical engineer, et cetera, would be involved in the information exchanges. And then there'd be data sources such as climate information and heat gains and other things as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So then activities, they're detailed sequential lists of task steps involved. So you'd list, the architect provides the architectural design documents to the mechanical engineer, et cetera. So the steps involved are outlined. Next slide. So then when you start talking in terms of who's saying what to whom, you begin to see blobs of data. And these would be initially kind of high level, and we call these data groups. And I think that term has carried forward in BDE work. Perhaps like local climatic conditions or lighting power and thermal properties, things of that sort. And then within those, you start identifying data elements, which are very granular and, power density, ballast type, luminaire type, et cetera, that gets very detailed. And the data elements are kind of the technical meat down at the bottom, and there can be thousands of those, obviously, in any reasonably complex activity. But thinking through the data exchange needs allows you to start identifying and enumerating and describing those. Next slide, please. So what we have basically is a use case document. When this gets written down, is is kind of how things should be done from our point of view, the domain point of view. And you start with a kind of folklore description of a professional task, and you end up with specifics that even a software developer could understand. And that would be the starting point of actual implementation that would hopefully match what the people who drew up the use case felt was the proper approach to automating their task or activity. So next. So now we're starting on a new revision, and we're broadening the scope. We're changing HVAC and R to built environment. And we're trying to do better at actually archiving common elements and use cases. And this will focus on the data.ashrae.org website, which I'll talk about in a second, and then try to do better outreach to get some accumulate some of the use cases. So next slide. So data.ashrae.org is a part of the ASHRAE website that is not behind any sort of paywall. It's a place for putting artifacts related to ASHRAE standards that are available free of charge. And right at the moment, it's got material for standard 205, which is the equipment data standard, standard 140, the method of test for simulation programs, and several other standards and research projects. So the idea is that data-related artifacts produced by ASHRAE activities could be posted here and made available without any requirements of login or membership or any sort of thing. So next slide. So now this whole thing, it's a swell idea, but not much has happened. The actual use cases that have been generated have been done under ASHRAE contracts. There aren't people beating down the doors to do this. Guideline 20 is now more than 10 years old, and not much has actually happened. And if you look at, say, the Building Smart website and some of the other related websites, you'll see dates like 2008 or 2012. Generally in this domain, in this realm, it's pushing string. It's not happening very quickly. There's several reasons for this, I think. There's probably, you guys can think of more, but first of all, the stuff is harder than it looks. Secondly, there's lack of resources in general for doing this. People don't have a lot of time they're trying to do their jobs rather than, really advance the world so much. There's a chicken and egg problem that software developers and application developers won't take advantage of this information unless it's there and ready to use. And conversely, nobody wants to develop it unless software developers are interested. So it's hard to get off the dime. And then additionally, a lot of the standards related to this, especially ISO standards, are expensive, and you can't like ease into this. If you want to get all the ISO standards in this realm, it's a pretty expensive proposition. So funding would help speed this up, and regulatory requirements for automated procedures will obviously motivate people to try to automate activities. So I do wonder if there's a better approach to doing this. I mean, IBPSA-USA has the data exchange activities that we're participating in right this minute. So maybe a critical mass can be formed and things can move faster. So let's hope so. So I think that's it. Are we going to do questions now or at the end? What's our plan?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do a couple questions now if there are any. If not, we can hold off and answer them or ask them at the end. So if there's any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question or type it in the chat.
Can you please elaborate on difficulty? You said this is pretty difficult to do.
Just to, well, my major experience in this realm of actually specifying data groups and data elements is standard 205, where we're developing representations for equipment performance data. There are a few people on this call who are on that committee too with me, are Tim McDowell and Neil Cruz, and I think Rob Hitchcock's on also, I think. In any case, we've been at it for, I don't know, I think it's 10 years. And we are in the, the committee's made up of a cross section. We have industry representatives and software people, and we talk and talk and talk about how do you, in a standard form, say, represent the performance of a chiller and achieve consensus on that. And it's just not fast to do it. So that's my point there. It's this is a lot. It's much easier to make a whole lot of different ways of doing something than it is to make one that people agree upon.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Great, thanks,
Okay.
Chip. We'll go ahead and move on here. There's some discussion in the chat if you would like to read it regarding the IDM and ISO standards. So it's interesting. Great, moving on here. So the next presenter is Ted Summer. He is a software developer with experience in various applications from backend development, application development, data pipelines, and visualization. He has an MS from University of Chicago in computer science, and he's been working on various projects regarding data exchange, including BuildingSync, Seed, and UrbanOpt. So go ahead, Ted.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a quick outline. First, we're going to do kind of an overview of what BuildingSync is, or what we hope it can, how we hope it can be useful to people, and then also how we use Schematron to kind of extend our base schema, and kind of how you write it, different patterns and things like that. Next slide, please. Cool. So just an overview of BuildingSync. As everybody knows, there are a lot of people that are involved in the process of like auditing or building and designing operating buildings. Problem is that everybody has a lot of different data formats, and there's not so much standardization. Well, there is actually, but we think we can solve some problems with our own schema. So that's kind of our goal, is to standardize some of this building data through an XML schema. So that's what BuildingSync is. It's actually an XML schema. So documents are written in XML. Next slide, please. Here's kind of a gross overview of some parts of BuildingSync. As I mentioned, it's a XML document or XML schema. So it's tree-like, as you can see here. So we have facilities, sites, different parts of a building. We have systems like HVAC, lighting systems, etc. And then also a lot of audit relevant information, because that is kind of BuildingSync's main use case, is for reporting audit data. Nick, please correct me if whenever I say anything really wrong. But yeah, that's my understanding as the basics. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we want a lot of different people and a lot of different applications to be able to use BuildingSync. So I didn't really say this, but our goal is, right, for someone to be able to have a data where they're building data somewhere and then share that with someone in a standardized way. And there are a lot of different people with different interests, as I already pointed out, who have different requirements about the types of data. So we made our schema pretty flexible. So we don't necessarily require that you define what the HVAC is in different parts of the building. So how do we solve that problem? Like for a specific application, just validating against the schema itself isn't going to let them know whether or not it meets their application requirements. So that's kind of where Schematron comes in. Next slide, please. Another term, I guess, used or I've seen used in the buildings domain is this model view definition, which is kind of like a lens into a schema or structured data. So here we have like a simplified version, right, of our schema. We have like the building, it has structures and it has systems, and they have sub-elements as well. So next slide, please. And MVD might be, like I said, kind of a lens. So we only care about certain parts for a particular application or use case. Next slide, please. So how is Schematron useful? This is kind of a flow of like how you might use Schematron. So on the far left, we have all of our starting documents, our BuildingSync documents. We pass that through a schema, which is our XML schema. So that could be BuildingSync. As you can see in the middle, some passed, some failed. And then we pass it through a second layer, which is Schematron here. And they're kind of our lenses that let us look at the data in a slightly different way. So the first document, you can see it passed our MVD1. The second one passed MVD2. And then the last document actually passes both model view definitions. So that means maybe you could use it for both applications or use cases. Next slide. So to actually explain what Schematron is, it lets you validate XML documents by writing tests that are in the format of XPaths, which is really cool. One thing you might say is like, well, if your schema is under constrained, why don't you just write another schema? That is an option, but Schematron provides even more flexibility because you can use XPath and all of its crazy functions and filters and things like that. So what it lets you do, as I said, it lets you make assertions about things. Maybe your schema, for instance, didn't require HVAC, but for our use case, we require that they define HVAC. So that's one thing it'll let you do. It also lets you do more complicated things like assertions about relationships, which, as I just mentioned, is not possible in XSD. So next, I'll kind of go through some examples and how you would write it in a Schematron. So next slide, please. So on the left is like, again, kind of a dummy schema. So at the top level, we have our building, and then we have a bunch of optional elements and sub-elements. So as you can see, all of the location, classification, structure, et cetera, are all optional. But maybe for our particular use case, we wanted both location and structured to be required. So we need to write a Schematron for it. So next slide, please. So here's kind of how you would do that. The neat thing about Schematron, actually, I don't know if I'd say neat, but it's written in XML. So this is just kind of a small snippet of a larger document you would have. So there are parent elements, of course, to this. But the way Schematron works, the way you write it is you provide a context. So you want to say, where am I testing this, which is an XPath. So in this case, we're saying we want to test at the root building element, and then you provide a test itself. So in this case, we're just saying location, and it's going to be relative to the context that you provided. So what Schematron will do is call bool, which is an XPath or XSLT function on any result. So in this case, it's going to call bool on the node of location, which is truthy. So it evaluates to true if it's there. And if it fails, or if it doesn't find location, so it doesn't find that node in the tree, then it's going to give the user this nice message in the blue saying like location's required. Same for structure. So we're saying within building, we want to assert that location's there. If it's not, let the user know that the location is required. Next slide, please. So you can also do more complicated things. So that example you could clearly do in XML schema itself, XSDs, but this one's a bit more complicated. So in this case, we have classification of the building and then a list of spaces, or a space that has a type as well as a count. And we want to assert that if our building classification is residential, then our space type must be apartment. And if the classification of our building is commercial, then our space type must be business. So next slide, see how to do that. So actually, sorry, these are examples real quick. So on the left are our valid documents. You can see we have a residential building and the space types are apartment and then building. commercial is business. Flip-flop them, that's invalid, right? We don't want a residential building that has business. Maybe you do, but in this case, we don't. Next slide, please. So how do you do that? XPath, again. So at the first SCH rule, our context is we're going to only select buildings where the classification text is residential. Then we're going to assert that the space type text is apartment. And then we're going to let them know, like, if that wasn't the case, that spaces / type must be apartment if classification is residential. Same thing for commercial. The way Schematron works is if a context does not match a node, so let's say our building classification was actually commercial, the whole first context, the first rule is actually not going to even get fired. So we don't have to worry about that test. It's only going to run the test for the nodes that it matches, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. Cool. So some other stuff you can do, you can get really fancy. You can create variables, you can use functions, as I mentioned, and then you can inject XML data into your user messages. So for this example, maybe the building has floors and gross floor area, and we want to assert that gross floor area equals the sum of all floor areas. So next slide to see some examples. So on the left here, you can see we have 2 floor areas, 100 and 200, and then we want to make sure that the gross floor area is 300, which is right in this case, and on the right it's wrong because 200 plus 100 is not 0. Next slide, please, to kind of see how this is implemented. So we're getting a little crazy here, but you can see we're inside of the building context again, and then we create a variable called floor area sum, and we define the value. Again, the value could be any XPath. In this case, we're using a function with an XPath inside of it. So we want to sum up all floors and floor area texts. And then our next line is where we actually assert that the gross floor area equals our calculated sum. And to make it nice for the user, we've provided this fancy user message. So we've said gross floor area, and then we inject the XPath value there. So we're going to grab the gross floor area and actually put it into the user message. It must be equal to the sum of the floor areas, which we can again use our variable by putting a $sign in front of it. Next slide, please. You can also get a little modular, write some functions or write things for reuse so you don't repeat yourself when validating things. So in this case, maybe there's multiple places inside of your schema that you want to assert there's a certain count of a particular element. And I'm probably won't go through all the details here, but you can see we have an abstract pattern is what it's called. We've defined the name. We allow users to pass in a rule context. So we're using that again with the $sign in front. And then we are asserting that the count of the element name that again the caller provided equals the number that the caller provided as well. And again, we can inject that into the user message. So that's a little fancier than what we saw before. Next slide. So this is how you use it. So this is how we call the function. We provide SCH params with the name and then value. So here, for instance, we're using it to assert that there are 3 floor areas. So we're saying look inside of floors and then look for the floor area element, and there should be 3 of them. That's pretty much it. It's pretty simple. Next slide. Cool. So another thing you can create are what's called abstract rules. They're kind of like abstract functions, but a little bit different. So in this case, let's say we're looking at 2 different schedules, lighting and occupancy inside of a building. They both have a start and an end time. We want to share the same assertions that the start should always be before the end time. So instead of writing that for both of them, we can create what's called an abstract rule. And so at the top on the right is where we've defined that rule. We say it's an abstract thing, and then we call it start-end. And then all we do is write the test itself and then provide a message. Then it's up to the user to write their own context like they normally do. And then they say it extends that rule that we named before. So they're saying it extends start-end. They can even provide extra assertions after that. But in this case, so what that allows, of course, is now they don't have to rewrite that assertion twice. It's more maintainable. So yeah, Next slide. Cool. So what can you do? I haven't really said this explicitly, but as you've seen from the examples, you can basically write anything that XPath allows you to write. You even have access to the entire XML tree. So even though you're within a context, you could reach across all the way to the root node and then do an entirely different XPath based on that. And as I mentioned, it'll call Boolean on the result to determine if a test's passed. What can you do with it? You can check for different things. You can check for the presence of elements or attributes. You can even check for value comparisons. So text contents or attribute contents, or if it's a number is greater than something else, etc. You can do Boolean expressions, or you can combine them. So you can use and ors, as well as parentheses, to chain as many as you want together. And yeah, you can use any XPath, as well as sometimes XSLT functions. So you can call sum on things, you can call count, you can see if something contains something else, like a substring, for instance. Yeah, the next slide. And that's it. If you're interested in seeing what more Schematron looks like how we actually use it, I have some links here. So we actually wrote an entire Schematron for an ASHRAE level 2 audit. It's quite large. And we tried to validate everything we could for a BuildingSync, I think version 2.1 file or 2.2. Actually, I think we're up to 2.3 right now. So you can have a valid 2.3 BuildingSync file, and the Schematron will tell you what it's missing basically for it to be considered a level 2 audit. We have an entire repository of our Schematron. We have different use cases written for the seed platform, as well as better analysis tool and audit template. You can see them all there. Lastly, we wrote some tools around Schematron. So we have a Schematron tool for Python, which kind of assists you writing Schematron in a more tabular format instead of having to write XML. And more importantly, it lets you have a Python interface for validating Schematron rather than having to deal with XSLT and things like that. And we also have a web portal. So that last link is somewhere where you can upload BuildingSync documents and see which Schematron it passes or fails without having to download anything yourself. I think that's it. Any questions? That was a lot. It was really fast.
How do we gain access to these links?
Great question. I can drop them in the chat as well, but I'm assuming these slides will be shared at the end of the presentation, or maybe not. I will drop the links in the chat right after I hop off.
Thank you.
This video will also be posted, and on that page, any links or slides that we want to make public will be available there. And a message will go out to everybody that is registered.
Cool. I see one question about Grasshopper tools. I'm actually not sure what Grasshopper tools. Maybe Nick could comment.
So no, we have not. So the question is, did you test Python Schematron with Grasshopper tools? No. There's no reason though that it wouldn't work. I mean, really the Python Schematron classes are designed to help build the Schematron test suite or the tests. I think more interesting would be to figure out if Grasshopper could run Schematron to validate the XML that's being used. And that would be definitely could be. I don't see why not, as long as you install a library that can execute Schematron, and something like LXML and Python, that pip package does support Schematron executions. So it should work. I don't know why not.
Cool. I see one other question about limitations being limited to XPath and XSLT. It can get a bit verbose or a little tricky to write, because it's in this weird place between letting you use business logic in your programming language to do validation and then like purely declarative, like a schema. It's kind of in a weird limbo. So sometimes it can be pretty frustrating to be more towards wanting to be more towards one side or another. And I will say XSLT1 is kind of limiting in the functions that it provides. So that includes XPath 1.0. But once you get to, if you provide an XSLT processor that is, I think, what are they on, 2 or 3? The newer one or newest one, being able to use those functions is incredibly powerful. I know they have built-in functionality that lets you do like some insane stuff. When you're limited to just 1.0, which is what's installed on most machines and easiest to install, then it is a bit trickier to do things, but it's still a bit more powerful, or a bit more powerful in a different way than just using XSD.
But you've never found a rule that you couldn't write.
That's right. Yeah, we've been able to do some pretty fancy stuff using variables and like, different filter. I can't remember the word. An XPath with square brackets to like filter. But yeah, we've been able to do pretty much everything we've needed so far.
Great, thanks. We're going to keep on moving here. We may have some time at the end to circle back and ask questions. Ted, thanks for dropping in the links into the chat. So we're going to go ahead and move on here. So the next presentation is by Stephen Roth. He is the president at Carmel Software and a seasoned software entrepreneur. Has lots of experience with creating and running high-tech startups. President of GBXML as well, and he's going to be talking today about the Schema Server. So go ahead.
All right, thank you, Nick. So as Nick had said, my name is Stephen Roth. I'm president of Carmel Soft, and we also oversee the Green Building XML, the GBXML schema. So today's webinar, as you know, is titled Guidelines and Projects for Building Data Exchange Integrity. And Chip and Ted both went over GPC 20 and also Schematron and BuildingSync XML. I will be demoing a beta of what's called Schema Server, an interoperability web portal. And first, I will discuss the purpose of this portal and some of the technologies behind it. And then I will actually do a demo of the portal itself. All right, so just a little background. Back in 2020, we received an SBIR, or Small Business Innovation and Research Grant from the US Department of Energy to help facilitate the flow of energy auditing information between disparate software tools using BuildingSync XML, the XML schema that Ted had talked about. Now, the gist of our proposal was simple: to integrate Pacific Northwest National Lab's Asset Score Audit Template tool with ASHRAE's Building EQ benchmarking tool using BuildingSync XML. And we propose integrating these two tools using the Schema Server portal that I will be demoing a little later. Now, this portal is currently in beta, and I'll demo it after a brief PowerPoint presentation where I'll explain what it's all about, because I want to make sure you understand its purpose. So I do want to give an overview of what exactly the portal does, its purpose, and then some of the technologies that it integrates with. So before I talk about the disparate technologies it integrates, I want to make sure that you all understand who is this tool geared toward. So what you see here is what's called an ecosystem model. This is something that we developed as part of the Energy I-Corps program that we participated in as part of the SBIR grant. And within the large ecosystem of basically real estate, we are targeting Schema Server toward design professionals, such as energy modelers, energy auditors, and also state and city-based energy efficiency regulatory organizations. So anything that's circled here. So this is kind of our target market, our core audience. All right, so now let's look at some of the tools that Schema Server integrates with. So I mentioned Asset Score Audit Template. Just to give you an overview of what it's all about, the US Department of Energy's Asset Score Audit Template tool is a web-based software application that is designed to allow building owners, managers, and operators to assess the energy performance of their buildings. And the tool is built on Energy Plus and calculates the EUI, which is used to calculate a building's asset score. Now, as part of Asset Score, there is what's called Audit Template. And this feature allows you to collect, store, and report building energy auditing data. So after entering the building audit data into the tool, users may generate an audit report, which lists all of the data entered and calculated, tables and charts outlining the building energy use by energy type and end use. Now, the nice thing about Audit Template is that you can export BuildingSync XML from this tool, which Ted had talked about, and I will demo this for you in a little bit. So the second tool that Schema Server integrates with is ASHRAE Building EQ. So for those of you who don't know what it is, ASHRAE Building EQ provides a quick energy analysis that benchmarks a building's energy performance. And Building EQ assists in the preparation of an ASHRAE Level 1 energy audit to identify means to improve a building's energy performance, including low-cost, no-cost energy efficiency measures. So there's two different modes in ASHRAE Building EQ, and truthfully, to demo this tool would take a whole nother webinar. There's in operation, which compares actual building energy use based on metered energy information, and then there's the as design mode. So BuildingSync XML. So Ted, went over BuildingSync XML in great detail, and I don't want to take too much time to explain it since he did a great job of explaining exactly what it is. But I did want to make sure that you do understand that the Schema Server tool does work very closely with BuildingSync XML. And then, of course, Schematron. Once again, Ted did a great job of explaining the intricacies of Schematron. But I do want to talk about how we use it in Schema Server. So basically, the way we're using it is it allows us to perform validation for a specific software tool. So for example, if I export BuildingSync XML from Audit Template, and I have all this energy auditing information in this XML file, and then I want to import it into ASHRAE Building EQ. However, ASHRAE Building EQ requires a unique subset of elements and data to properly calculate a building EQ score and various EUI values. So Schematron can be scripted to validate the BuildingSync XML specifically for ASHRAE Building EQ. And it can also be scripted to validate for any BuildingSync XML consuming software tool. So that's the great thing about Schematron. It allows you to validate for specific software tools, which is exactly what we do. And I'll show you that in a bit. All right, we all know what Energy Star Portfolio Manager. This is another tool that Schema Server integrates with. Just as an overview, Energy Star PM is a web-based resource management tool that enables users to benchmark the energy use of any type of building, and almost 25% of commercial buildings in the US are benchmarked using Portfolio Manager, which is pretty amazing. And the Energy Star score compares your building's energy performance to similar buildings normalized for weather and operating characteristics. So Schema Server connects with Energy Star Portfolio Manager using its API. It allows users to select from a list of properties, then within each property, select from a list of meters, then within each meter, import monthly meter data for many different fuel types. All right, so this slide kind of gives you an overview of how everything is interrelated. So I will explain it. It's a little busy. So on the left here, we have Asset Score Audit Template, which I talked about. So you create a project in Audit Template. You save as BuildingSync XML. You import into this web-based Schema Server tool. Then Schema Server will use Schematron to validate it. It will, if you happen to have that same building in your Energy Star Portfolio Manager account, you can import the utility data from Portfolio Manager. Also, if you happen to have that building as a 3D model in Revit, you can save as GBXML and then view that model within the portal. Then once you've done the validation and viewed it within Schema Server, then you can save as BuildingSync XML, or actually using Building EQ API, you send the BuildingSync XML file to ASHRAE Building EQ. It will perform its calculations, then send back EUI values to Schema Server that will be displayed. And I'm going to show you exactly how that works. So this is kind of how all the technologies and software tools that I just talked about in the previous slides integrate with one another. All right, just a brief overview of GBXML. I'm sure most of you know what GBXML is, but maybe there's some new people here. So we call it Schema Server for a reason. We don't just want to validate BuildingSync XML. Eventually, we would like to validate many different types of XML schemas. And an additional schema that it works with is obviously Green Building XML. So the way we work with GBXML and Schema Server is it will do basic XML validation. We don't have a Schematron yet available for it. And it will also allow you to view the GBXML file within your browser using Spider Viewer, which was developed by Ladybug Tools. And as an overview, GBXML, I like to call it as the language of buildings, and it allows disparate building design software tools and BIM authoring tools to all communicate with one another. So you may wonder, what is the difference between GBXML and BuildingSync XML? Well, GBXML focuses on building thermal design data, so it can be imported into a wide variety of building design tools, such as energy modeling, load calcs, CFD, lighting, etc. BuildingSync XML focuses on building energy auditing data. So that's the difference. All right. So now I'd like to move on to an actual demo of the beta of Schema Server. So I'm going to be actually demoing two things. It looks like I have about 12 minutes left, so this shouldn't take too long. I want to demo the standalone website very quickly. Then I also want to demo how you can access it directly from Audit Template. And we actually used a Docker instance of ASHRAE Audit Template, which the folks at PNNL provided us, and we installed it on our own Microsoft Azure. So I will be showing you that too. So bear with me while I open my browser. Okay, so what you are looking at here, for those of you familiar with ASHRAE Audit Template, this is exactly that. However, it's our own personal instance of it. Because like I said, we took a Docker instance of ASHRAE Audit Template that is provided by PNNL. We installed it on Microsoft Azure. So this is our own custom version of ASHRAE Audit Template. So most everything is exactly the same. We created just one project called NYC Building 3. And bear with me while it loads up, okay? But one thing that we did add is our own custom button called Schema Upload. And this button will connect directly to Schema Server. However, before I show that, I do want to demo the Schema Server website. So this is Schema Server. Like I said, it's in beta. Just type schemaserver.com and we'll forward to our beta site. I'm not going to take all the time to register right now. You can do that on your own. I'm just going to log in using an existing account. All right, so within Schema Server, you can create projects. Projects are basically buildings. So you can see I have a number of sample New York City buildings listed here. And then I'll select one of my existing ones. Some basic demographic information about the building. I do want to show you how we integrate with Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So I'll click the button here, and we're actually calling the eStar PM API. And what I've done is through my Schema Server account, I've entered the credentials for my PM account. So I'm able to call the API and retrieve all my properties that I have within my Energy Star Portfolio Manager account. So these are some of my sample properties that I have in there. I'm going to select this first property. And within that property, I have all my meters. So I'll select the electrical grid meter. And within that, list all of my monthly utility data for my electrical grid meter. So what it will do is when I click import meter data, it will import the latest 12 months of meter data into the database. And then it will export that information to Building EQ, which I'll show you in a little bit. So let me go back to my project. So I've imported my Energy Star Portfolio Manager utility data for the past 12 months. This little star in the button tells me that I've indeed done that. So now down here is a list of all my schema uploads. So as you notice, obviously there's more than one. So what you're able to do is you can actually import as many versions of your BuildingSync XML schema as you want. So this is almost like a version control. So for example, suppose you're an ASHRAE Audit Template and you make some changes. For example, if you change the building square feet and you want to resave as that BuildingSync XML and re-import into Schema Server, well, you can do that. And you can keep track of all of the changes that you've made to that project. And then once you go into it, so I'll go into my latest version of my schema, you can do diffs and you can view the differences between this version and previous versions. So think of it as almost kind of like a version control, kind of a very simple Git or GitHub. So here I've selected one of the versions of the schema that I imported from Asset Score Audit Template. And then there's a couple things I can do. I can actually view the schema or validate. Let's talk about viewing first. So I can download the schema to my local machine if I want to. I can display the actual XML file within my browser. Nothing too fancy here. But the nice thing is I can view differences between the latest version and a previous version of the schema. So if I click show differences, it will show me the differences between the two versions. So currently there's just differences in some of the ID names, but if I scroll down enough, I'll see that maybe there's differences in the square footages between one version to another. So this is very helpful in keeping track of all versions of your BuildingSync XML file for a particular project. So let me go back and validate. So when I click this validate button, what's going to happen is we actually created our own little mini Schematron server. And this little on Microsoft Azure. And this little mini Schematron server validates specifically for importing BuildingSync XML into ASHRAE Building EQ. That's all it does. So if I click validate, it calls that Schematron server, and it provides me a simple web-based report. And basically it's telling me here that my BuildingSync XML is missing two mandatory fields that are required by ASHRAE Building EQ, specifically cooling degree days and heating degree days. So in fact, this information is not even entered in the audit template portion of Asset Score. So what that means is what it's going to do is when I call the ASHRAE Building EQ API to send this information over, it's going to fill it in with default data that I assign to my account. But I can always go back into ASHRAE Building EQ and override that data if I want. Then down here are a list of additional errors. Now these aren't as important as the errors up here. In other words, you'll still be able to get an ASHRAE Building EQ score and EUI values, but it is missing information if you indeed want to be, if you want your project to be accepted by ASHRAE. But once again, you can manually go into ASHRAE Building EQ and enter this data. So let me back out. And let me back out once again. And I'm going to select the previous version of the schema, BuildingSync XML schema for this project that I had imported. And I'm going to show you an additional item here. So you can import an additional schema in addition to your BuildingSync XML schema. So in this case, I imported a GBXML file. So perhaps you have a 3D representation of your building in Revit. You save as GBXML. Then you can import it into here and you can view it. So you can display the XML, and I won't go through all this, but the main thing is it now is calling the Ladybug Tools Spider Viewer. So now you can view this model within your web browser. And once again, it's a whole nother webinar to explain this viewer, but you can do a lot with this within your browser. View, pan, zoom in, zoom out, etc. All right. So let me back out. And now that I've imported my BuildingSync XML, I validated it, I want to send it on over to ASHRAE Building EQ. So I've already pre-entered my credentials for ASHRAE Building EQ into my account. Everything's all secure and encrypted. Currently, we only integrate with one tool right now, export to one tool, and that's ASHRAE Building EQ. That was part of our original proposal. I click sync. It's calling the ASHRAE Building EQ API. It's returning all of my projects that I've entered in ASHRAE Building EQ. This is my test account. And then I'm going to select a project where I want to send my BuildingSync XML file over. It's going to perform the calculations and return some EUI values. So I'm going to click sync. And it's returned are my median and source EUI values that were calculated by ASHRAE Building EQ. And that's it. Fairly simple, but a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot more to the site. Like I said, we don't have much time to go through it, but feel free to register and use it as you like, schemaserver.com. One final thing I want to show is, I mentioned to you that we have our own Docker instance of Asset Score Audit Template. And we customized it. We added our own schema upload button. So what we've done basically is we've directly integrated Schema Server into Audit Template. So if you click that, it calls the Schema Server website. I'll log in with my account. It's sending the BuildingSync XML file that was generated by this project in Audit Template. with me. Hopefully it works. There we go. And then I can select the project that I want to import that BuildingSync XML into. And then when I click that project, it's automatically going to perform the Schematron validation. And in this case, it's going to pop up a message basically saying there's some mandatory errors. If you remember when I showed you those two cooling heating degree day errors, well, those are indeed them. But in this instance, I'm just going to ignore this. And then now it's going to bring up the list of ASHRAE Building EQ projects. I'll select the project, click sync, and it's now sending that information over. So pretty much within about 4 or 5 clicks, I'm able to get information over from Audit Template into ASHRAE Building EQ. So like I said, this is a beta. This is just one use case. I foresee many additional use cases in the future, as we build upon this tool. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We have a time for about 2 questions. Tim is trying to register. I don't know if you see this chat in the chat log there, Stephen. But anyways, maybe you can follow up with them offline on that. If there are any questions regarding this or any of the other presentations, we can go ahead and ask those now. Okay, well, I assume everyone's just shocked by all the information that was just presented. So, Mike, is there any last comments that you'd like to make before we wrap this up?
Nope, you can go ahead and you can see we've got Stephen's email here. We'll also drop that into the chat, and you can check it out on video and share with all your friends. That will be launched on our YouTube channel within 24 hours. Great.
Well, thank you, everybody. And we appreciate you attending. And there is the Building Data Exchange subcommittee in IBPSA. Those meetings happen once a month. Check the website for more information on when the next one will be. Thank you, everybody, for attending.